A closer look at the inescapable math of climate change, part 2 of 3, Debunking CBC's Climate Propaganda. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society, and I'm doing one of the things I like most, and that is debunking CBC propaganda. So let's see what the state-funded broadcaster brought us in a recent report about the greenhouse gas inventory and the social costs of carbon. And they also talked with some experts, or one expert, who's also government funded. But we'll get into that later. You'll have a look at that. So this is part 2 of a 3-part series on the inescapable math. We'll see how good they are at math. So this is the story that we're working on. So the whole premise of it is inescapable math of climate change. And let's see what they're talking about. So CBC has no questions about the big 3 climate plan priorities discussed with Dale Begin of Canadian Climate Institute, but we do. So here are the 3. They wanted policy certainty in contracts for difference. They wanted to build a bigger and cleaner electricity grid, and they were interested in creating emissions certainty for oil and gas. And CBC actually wrote that, in other words, with quick and effective action, Canada's goals will become increasingly plausible. Well, let's see if that's true. So point 1, contracts for difference. Our view is that this is basically an attempt to bribe investors by passing a law that will guarantee their returns related to carbon pricing, even if the market falls below the government's set price. The intention is to try and make this into an act of parliament that could not be repealed by any future government. So this is the Canadian Climate Institute, the organization that came up with these 3 points in that interview. And here's the fellow who brought them up in the interview. And note that he's an undergrad in mechanical engineering. And here they say this is a nonpartisan government-funded organization. So Canadian Climate Institute is a registered charity in Canada, and these are their goals: conducting research related to climate change and publishing the results for the public, producing and publishing educational materials to increase the public's understanding of climate change, to protect and preserve the environment for the benefit of the public by conserving and restoring ecosystems on a long-term basis through climate change mitigation, adaptation, and clean growth practices and policies, and to receive and maintain a fund or funds and apply all or part of the principal and income from time to time to qualified donees. So they're going to be lending out or giving out money to other activist groups, it seems. Now, if you look at the CRA, Canada Revenue Agency Charities Directorate, you find this graph of their most recent filing, and you find that 97.81% of the Canadian Climate Institute revenues are from government, and they have about 2.4 million in the kitty. And they only have 5,000 in receipted donations. So I would like to mention here that, you know, the whole idea of a registered charity is that people who are self-interested in that cause are the ones who are supposed to fund it, and in return for their support, they get a tax write-off. So, you know, the idea was that if you're interested in protecting a little wetland, you know, and creating maybe a little bird farm or something like that, you and your group of bird watchers fund the project. You probably run it with mostly volunteers, and because it's your project, you donate money to it, then you get a tax write-off. Or let's say in the case of a loved one who passes away from some kind of disease or condition. So maybe you have some funds, you start a charity in their name, and other people who have faced similar tragedies support this cause for research or for equipment for the hospital. And so you get a tax write-off for doing this service because the government doesn't have to do it. So the government didn't have to fund the bird farm to make enjoyment for the people who like that natural part of the world. And the government didn't have to fund the research for whatever condition your little charitable foundation started, right? That's why you get a tax write-off. So why is this a charity being funded by government? How can it be a charity? How is it a charity? Why is it a charity? And they say that they want to educate people about climate change, but in fact, somehow they failed to miss this. They failed to see this report by the Parliamentary Budget Officer from November of last year. I think it came out November 22nd or something like that, November 8th. Anyway, this article is by Ross McKittrick, who's been studying this topic for decades and has many peer-reviewed papers on it. So the Parliamentary Budget Officer found that the benefit attributable to the Paris Agenda is that the economy will be 0.8% larger 80 years from now. That's a minuscule difference, right? So CBC says, by contrast, one way or another, Canada's emissions have to be reduced. The choice isn't even between implementing a carbon tax or doing nothing. Even if it was, doing nothing would involve incredible costs. But the Parliamentary Budget Officer found that it would not involve incredible costs. So why is CBC presenting a false narrative? Why have they not interviewed Dr. Ross McKittrick? CBC's Aaron Wary writes, the math of climate change is unavoidable. Well, the math is here on this page. If every country meets Paris targets, the economic benefit would be minuscule. And the economic damage of trying, as we see in Europe, would be horrific. So here's CBC's journalistic standards, their mission and principles: to serve the public interest, to contribute to the understanding of issues of public interest. They claim that they're independent of all lobbies, all political and economic influence. Public interest guides all our decisions, and we are aware of the impact of our work and are honest with our audiences. Based on what we just saw, I don't think any of that's true. Like, why would they only present one point of view? Why would they not present the information from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, which was published several months ago and written up in the Financial Post by Dr. Ross McKittrick, a very credible person who's been working on the social cost of carbon and climate change issues for decades? How could they leave that out? I think they're not being straight with us. So let's look at this contract for differences. Robert Lyman is a former public servant and diplomat. He's written a number of things for us, and we covered this whole idea of contracts for differences a few months ago after a conference where Stephen Guilbeault and a few other environmental types floated this idea. So Robert Lyman thinks it's just hubris. So we wrote this at the event. The notion was floated that carbon pricing uncertainty could be solved by enshrining Canada's intended $170 a ton carbon tax in a permanent contracts for differences law of some kind, which could never be repealed by any subsequent government. The theory is that this form of guaranteed payment would open the floodgates of investment. And Robert Lyman said, I've never seen an example of hubris that exceeds this proposal, no doubt inspired by the companies and groups that now expect to benefit competitively from the proposed freezing of carbon tax rates in future at the rates already announced but not implemented by the Trudeau government. And just imagine now, uh, at that point in time, we were talking about $170 a ton, but they just upped it to what, 265, 261? They just quadrupled it from what it already is. So, and they want to enshrine this kind of thing in law. So Robert Lyman, again talking about the contracts for differences, he says this proposal makes no sense. It's infeasible in a democracy. Well, think what that means. Does that mean that we have to have a dictatorship to do it? Perhaps. We should be wary of that. He notes that the Canadian carbon tax rate is already one of the highest in the world. He notes that our Canada's projected growth in income will be the lowest in the OECD. And do we need to lock in one of the main sources of our higher costs, that being this kind of contracts for differences and carbon taxes? He finds it to be hubris and elitist. And such demands for exceptionalism reek of privilege and vested interest in their pursuit of economic rent at the expense of other citizen taxpayers. Have the climate zealots and the industries they support no shame? And carbon dioxide taxes are only one of over 300 current policy and program measures that federal and provincial governments have implemented to promote the reduction of GHG emissions. Together, they mark an unprecedented set of interventions for a small number of industries. I counted 24 different generic subsidies to renewable energy industries alone. So, he says the proposal makes no sense. Now, the second point that Dale Begin and Aaron Weary discussed was building a bigger and cleaner electricity grid. And remember, I mentioned that Begin apparently has an undergrad degree in mechanical engineering. So the facts are that Canada already has one of the cleanest grids in the world. If we just look at energy supply, electricity generation by source, and this is from the International Energy Agency, we find that Canada has massive hydro as our source of electricity generation. And we also have some nuclear, we have natural gas, and we have reducing coal, right? And look at this, renewables down here. This is wind and solar. But this is only the electricity, and they want to build a bigger and cleaner electricity grid, presumably to erase all of this. But you have to recognize that energy on a broad base is used in very different ways. So if we look at total energy supply in Canada by source, we find here coal, we find natural gas, that's a huge amount of natural gas, nuclear, this is hydro. So suddenly hydro looks quite a bit smaller, doesn't it? Then we have oil here in the orange. Where did my cursor go? There we go. Oil in this orange, and then in this thin band here of kind of gold, we have biofuels and waste. And then there's a teeny tiny little, barely visible, you can't hardly see it, strip there. That's wind and solar. Okay, so just imagine that. We're being told that by 2035 we can have an east-west power grid, that we can decarbonize society by going to electric vehicles, which need more electricity generation than we presently have. They need at least 10,000 megawatts more. We're being told that we can also electrify our homes. We won't need to use natural gas. And you know, when you look at this graph, the infrastructure that brings us this energy, it took us over 100 years to build it. And yet they think that within, 10, 20 years, we're going to flip everything overnight. I don't think so. So this net zero 2050 is magical thinking. Like, you can just see it right there. That's not going to expand very fast, if ever. And of course, you don't have to ask us, because we're probably called names over there like denier. You could ask SNC-Lavalin, everyone's favorite engineering firm, engineering net zero. In this report, which was issued, I believe, in 2019, so it's been around for a while, CBC says the second of those is a massive undertaking, that's referring to expanding the grid, but it might also be the easiest of the three to accomplish. So here's what SNC-Lavalin offers to put things in perspective using today's specific capacity factors without accounting for the replacement of existing aging generation. If one were to meet this challenge using only one power generation type, additional capacities required to add 1,000 terawatts would translate to 115 times 1,100 megawatt sized large hydro reservoirs like BC's Site C Dam. Now, that's way over budget, and it's been in progress for decades. 114 times 1,000 megawatt large nuclear reactors, which would be 19 sites the size of Bruce Power. 380 times 300 megawatt small modular reactors, 20,000 times 10 megawatt sized wind turbines, 200 wind farms with 100 turbines for an aggregated capacity of 1,000 megawatts per site, or more than 400 gigawatts of aggregate solar capacities. So they're saying under this assumption, the overall average annual capacity additions would need to be between 5 and 7 gigawatts annually for the next 30 years, roughly 3 times the average annual amount added over the last 50 years. Yeah, that doesn't sound like the easiest of the three to accomplish. Now, some people say, oh, but the Royal Bank came up with the $2 trillion transition. They think it will be economically feasible and it wouldn't be too difficult. Well, our professional engineering team looked at that and we found that actually they made quite a few mistakes. And, let me just say here, one of the mistakes that people often make is they assume that a wind turbine of 1 megawatt is equal to 1 megawatt of power from a dispatchable source like coal, nuclear, hydro, or natural gas. But it's not, because these are dispatchable forms of power which you can basically turn on or off. You can add more power to the grid or turn them off at will, depending on the demand or supply, right? But with wind and solar, it's completely reliant on the weather. So it's not a dispatchable form of power. These are not the same things. So that's where most people make their mistake by saying, oh, if we just phase out coal, we'll add an equivalent number of wind turbines and we're done. It doesn't work that way. So if we go back to our calculations, we find that you can see the numbers here that we found in doing a thorough assessment are astronomical. So the annual cost, RBC thinks it'd be 5.4 billion. It'll actually be 320 billion. The capital cost will be 4,000 billion. The emissions reductions would be 100,000 tons, but that per ton, $100,000 per ton. And actually the IPCC sets the price at $15 per ton. So, we're not getting good calculations from people out there in the market, neither from the Canadian Climate Institute or from RBC. And then CBC comes up with number 3, which is creating emissions certainty for oil and gas. So they want to cap oil and gas. They want to reduce oil and gas. They see this as like the biggest chunk of emissions, right? But, what part of the Canadian economy does not need oil and gas or their byproducts? Like, please tell us what part of the economy doesn't need oil and gas. And this is some information from the Natural Resources Energy Factbook. So activists claim that energy is not a major contributor to our income. And they think it only in Alberta do we make money from oil and gas. We do make money from oil and gas in Alberta. The energy sector GDP was 59.6 billion, but in all the other provinces it was also big. 15.6 billion in Ontario, 12 billion in Quebec, 11.8 billion in BC, 10.5 billion in Saskatchewan. So where will that money come from if you phase out or cap oil and gas? And activists claim that there are not very many revenues from the energy industry. But in fact, it was the average annual government revenue from the petroleum sector from 2015 to 2019, which were not great years actually, it was $13 billion. So this is 6.9% of total taxes paid by all industries. What are we going to replace that with? Who's going to pay those taxes? Where will that income come from? So you see, it's silly to look at this and think that you can cut this in half or reduce it or shut it down completely without collapsing all of these other industries which rely on this for the energy and power. And actually, you see, we are a global trader in oil and gas. So here we are in the natural gas market in 2020. Here we are in oil in 2018. And yet we're blocked from market because of the tar sands campaign. And CBC is wrong. So CBC says what the Parliamentary Budget Office report leaves out is the simple and undisputed fact that one way or another Canada's emissions have to be reduced dramatically. The choice isn't between implementing a carbon tax or doing nothing. Even if it was, doing nothing would involve incredible costs. Well, the Parliamentary Budget Officer disputes this, and using IPCC models and a 2.5 degrees Celsius warming, they found the economic impact would be negligible. So CBC is wrong. Again, there's no need to divide society with dangerous dreams of climate ideologues. Energy is life. We have to get it together, people. Energy illiteracy and climate policies are destroying Canada and creating the global energy crisis, famine, and widespread heat or eat poverty. So I hope that you will help us educate Canadians. I hope you'll join, you donate, sponsor, or share our materials. If you'd like to send us an e-transfer, you can do so at contact@friendsofscience.org. You can donate online, you can join online, you can call the office if you don't want to use your card online. I hope that this has given you some insights into how the tax-funded Canadian broadcaster is misleading the public and not even using public documents from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, which is really a shame. And, making up things like it would be easy to build out a bigger, better electricity grid. As you saw, it would be astronomically difficult, extraordinarily expensive, and probably would end us up in national blackouts, because once you start to tinker with something that works as well as the power grids in most of our provinces, you know what they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So stay tuned for part 3. I want to thank you for watching this one. I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science. Thanks so much.